I returned from America to live with my son. It was the biggest mistake of my life. I flew across the world twice for the people I loved, once to save them, and once because I believed they finally wanted to save me. I gave 16 years of my life scrubbing floors and caring for strangers' dying parents in America, sending every single dollar home, telling myself it was all for my son's future. And when he finally called and asked me to come home, to let him take care of me the way I had once taken care of him, I believed my sacrifice had finally been rewarded. I sold everything I owned in the United States. I packed 16 years of savings into a single suitcase and flew home with more hope than I had felt in decades. For a little while, it truly did feel like the ending I had always dreamed of. Marigolds at the airport, grandchildren I barely knew climbing into my lap, a home that finally felt like mine. But somewhere between the warm welcome and the quiet, cold months that followed, I discovered a truth no mother ever wants to face about her own child. And by the time I understood what was actually happening inside that house, I had already lost almost everything I spent 16 years building. This is the story of what happened when I went looking for home and found something else entirely. My name is Charulata, and for 16 years, my hands smelled like drugoi people's homes. Not my own home, someone else's. I want you to understand something before I tell you what happened to me, because if you do not understand this first part, you will not understand how deep the wound went later. I was not always alone. I had a husband once, a good man, gentle in the way that some men are gentle without ever having to try. His name was Anand. We had one son together, Rohan, born when I was 26 years old, and for a few years, our life in Ahmedabad was simple and full. Anand worked in a small textile shop. I stayed home and raised our boy, and in the evenings we would sit outside on a mat and watch the neighborhood children play cricket in the dust. Then Anand got sick. It was his liver, the doctors said, though we never fully understood why, since he barely drank. Within 8 months, he was gone. I was 34 years old, a widow with a 9-year-old son and very little savings. In our community, a widow with a child is looked at a certain way, not unkindly exactly, but with pity, and pity has its own kind of cruelty. People would visit, bring sweets, ask if I needed anything, and then go home to their own full lives while I lay awake wondering how I would pay for Rohan's school fees the following month. I did what many women in my position did. I worked. I sewed blouses for a tailor down the street. I helped an aunt sell vegetables at the market before dawn. I cleaned 2 houses in the afternoons. None of it was enough, not really, but it kept us alive, and it kept Rohan in school, which was the only thing that mattered to me. I used to tell myself, if my son gets an education, if my son becomes someone, then all of this suffering will have been worth it. When Rohan was 22, he got accepted into a graduate program in the United States, computer science. I remember the day the acceptance letter came. I could not read the English words myself, but a neighbor translated it for me. And I cried so hard I had to sit down on the kitchen floor. My son, my boy who used to fall asleep on my lap during power cuts, who used to hide behind my sari when strangers came to the house, he was going to America. Of course, there was no way I could pay for his education. We borrowed money from relatives, we sold what little gold jewelry I had left from my wedding, and somehow we scraped together enough for the first year. I told him, "Do not worry about the rest. I will find a way." And I did find a way, though it was not the way I expected. A cousin of mine who had immigrated to New Jersey years earlier told me about agencies that placed Indian women as home caregivers for elderly Americans. The pay, converted into rupees, seemed impossible. More in 1 month than I could earn in 6 back home. I was 42 years old when I left India for the first time in my life, carrying 1 suitcase and a photograph of Anand tucked inside my blouse. I will not pretend those early years in America were easy. They were not. I lived in a small room in a house shared with 3 other caregivers, all of us working different shifts, so we rarely saw each other awake. My first client was an elderly man named Mr. Feldman, 91 years old, who had dementia and would sometimes forget I was not his late wife. I bathed him, fed him, changed him, sat with him through nights when he cried out for people who had died decades earlier. It was hard work, humbling work, the kind of work that ages you from the inside. But I did it, month after month, year after year, because every single dollar I earned, I sent home. First to pay for Rohan's remaining tuition. Then, after he graduated and got a good job in California, I kept working anyway, because now I had a new dream. I wanted to build something for my own future. I did not want to be a burden on my son, the way I had felt like a burden on others after Anand died. I wanted one day to return to India with enough saved that I could live with dignity, that I could contribute to whatever life my son built, rather than simply depend on it. 16 years. That is how long I stayed in America, moving from one elderly client to another, watching other people's grandchildren grow up through photographs on their refrigerators, while my own grandchildren grew up on video calls thousands of miles away. Rohan married a woman named Priya in India, a marriage I flew back for during one of my rare breaks, and within a few years, they had 2 children, a daughter, Ananya, and later a son, Kabir. I met my grandchildren mostly through a phone screen. I watched Ananya's first steps on a shaky video call at 4 in the morning, sitting on the edge of my narrow bed in New Jersey, crying silently so I would not wake my roommates. By the time I turned 58, I had saved more money than I ever imagined possible for a woman like me, a woman who once could not afford her son's school shoes. I am not going to pretend I had some enormous fortune, but by Indian standards, and even by American standards for someone my age with my background, it was substantial. Enough, I believed, to live comfortably for the rest of my life, enough to help my family without depending on charity, enough to finally rest. And then Rohan called me. I remember exactly where I was standing when he said it, in the kitchen of the house where I worked, washing dishes for my 3rd client that year, an elderly woman named Mrs. Whitfield, who had grown fond of me over the previous 2 years. Rohan's voice on the phone was warmer than I had heard it in a long time. "Ma," he said, "come home. Come live with us. You have given your whole life for me. Now it is time I take care of you. You should not be washing strangers' dishes at your age. Come home and let me repay you." I sat down on Mrs. Whitfield's kitchen floor, the same way I had sat on my own kitchen floor 16 years earlier when Rohan's acceptance letter arrived, and I wept. I wept because I had waited so long to hear those words. Every sacrifice, every lonely night, every holiday spent caring for someone else's family instead of my own. In that moment, it all felt worth it. My son wanted me back. My son wanted to take care of me. I gave Mrs. Whitfield's family 2 months' notice, which they were gracious about, and they even threw me a small farewell gathering, tears in eyes that were not used to shedding them for hired help. I sold the few pieces of furniture I owned in America. I closed out what accounts I needed to close, and I transferred nearly all of my savings. 16 years of scrubbing floors and changing diapers for grown men and women who were once powerful, successful people, into an account I could access from India. I remember packing my suitcases and thinking, this is it. This is the reward. Not a mansion, not luxury, just this. A home with my son, my daughter-in-law, and the grandchildren I barely knew, where I could finally stop being useful to strangers and start simply being loved by my own family. When I landed in Ahmedabad, Rohan was waiting at the airport with Ananya and Kabir, both children holding handmade signs with my name on them, decorated with crayon flowers. Priya stood a step behind them, smiling, holding a garland of marigolds she placed around my neck the moment I walked through the doors. I remember thinking, as I hugged my son for the first time in almost 3 years, that I had never felt so certain I had made the right decision. I did not know then that this airport, this golden afternoon full of marigolds and children's laughter, would be the last truly happy day I would experience in that house. I did not know that everything I had built over 16 years of exile from my own life was about to be taken from me. Not by strangers, not by thieves, but by the very people I had crossed an ocean twice to be near. But that story is for later. Right now, I only knew one thing. I was home. And for a little while, home felt exactly like I had dreamed it would. The first 3 months in Rohan's house were, I want to be honest, the happiest I had been in years. My daughter-in-law Priya gave me the largest guest room, the one with the window facing the garden, and told me it was mine for as long as I wanted. My grandchildren, who had only known me through a phone screen, warmed to me faster than I expected. Ananya, who was 7 years old, would climb into my lap every evening and ask me to tell her stories about America, what the snow felt like, whether I had ever seen a real bear, what my elderly clients used to say to me. Kabir, only 4, simply liked to sit near me while I hummed old songs my own mother used to hum to me. Rohan would come home from his office job. He worked for an American software company with an office in Ahmedabad, earning what was considered an excellent salary, and in those early weeks he made a point of sitting with me every evening. He would ask about my day, about my health, whether my knees still bothered me from all those years of standing. He told his colleagues about me, he said, told them his mother had worked so hard in America that she deserved to be treated like a queen now. I believed him. I had no reason not to. It was in the 4th month that the first request came. Rohan came to me one evening looking troubled, the kind of expression he used to wear as a boy when he had broken something and was trying to decide whether to confess or hide it. He told me the company he worked for was going through layoffs, and while his own position was safe for now, Priya's father had recently suffered a health scare, and the medical bills were mounting faster than the family could manage. He did not ask directly. That was never his way. He simply laid out the problem in front of me, the way you might lay out a puzzle, and waited for me to offer the solution myself. Of course I offered. What kind of mother would I be if my son's father-in-law was suffering and I sat with money doing nothing? I gave them what they needed, not a small amount, but not something that frightened me either. I told myself, this is what family does. This is exactly why I came home. Not to hoard money in a bank account, but to be useful to the people I love in the ways that actually matter. A month later, it was the roof. The monsoon had damaged part of the house, Rohan explained, and repairs were expensive, and it would be better to fix it properly now rather than patch it temporarily and pay twice later. Again, I gave what was asked. Then it was Priya's brother, who needed capital to start a small business importing electronics. A sure thing, Rohan assured me, an investment that would double within a year. Then it was school fees for Ananya at a more prestigious private school, because did I not want my granddaughter to have opportunities I never had? Each request came wrapped in logic, and each logic seemed sound on its own. That was the cruelty of it, if I am honest with you now. No single request felt unreasonable. It was only when I finally sat down one evening, nearly 10 months after arriving, and tried to calculate how much I had given away, that the coldness truly hit me. I had transferred away more than half of everything I had saved across 16 years of caring for other people's dying parents. I want to pause here and tell you something about the culture I come from, because I think it matters for understanding why I did not stop this sooner. In our tradition, a mother does not keep ledgers with her own son. To ask, "Where has my money gone?" feels almost like an accusation, an insult to the bond between parent and child. For months, I silenced the small voice inside me that whispered something was wrong, because I told myself that voice was ungrateful, that it did not understand real love, that real love does not count rupees. But the small voice did not stay silent forever. It was Priya's brother's business, the sure investment, that finally forced my eyes open. 6 months after I gave the capital for it, I asked gently how the business was doing. Rohan's face changed in a way I had never seen before. Not sadness exactly. Something closer to irritation, as though I had asked an inappropriate question at an inappropriate time. He told me the business had run into some difficulties, and that it was complicated, and that I would not really understand the details. When I pressed, gently still, asking simply whether the money might eventually come back, he said something that I have replayed in my mind hundreds of times since. He said, "Ma, you did not come back to India to count coins. You came back to be with family. Is family not worth more than money?" At the time, shame flooded through me so quickly that I apologized. I apologized to my own son for asking about my own money. I told myself he was right, that I was being small-minded, that 16 years in America chasing dollars had corrupted something in me that a true Indian mother should never lose. I went to bed that night feeling guilty, not betrayed. It took me many more weeks to understand that guilt was exactly the reaction he wanted from me. The tone of the house had begun shifting, slowly enough that I could almost convince myself I was imagining it. Priya, who used to sit with me in the kitchen in the mornings while we prepared breakfast together, started finding reasons to be elsewhere. The children were still affectionate, but I began to notice Priya redirecting them. Let Grandma rest now. Even when I had not asked to rest, even when I wanted nothing more than their small hands in mine. Dinner conversations grew shorter. Rohan, once eager to hear about my day, now scrolled through his phone while I spoke, offering only half-hearted responses. When I brought up small things, a memory from his childhood, a story about his father, he would say, "Yes, yes, you have told me this before," even for stories I knew for certain I had never shared. I remember one night sitting alone in my guest room, the room with the window facing the garden that Priya had once told me was mine for as long as I wanted, and feeling a loneliness more profound than anything I experienced during those 16 isolated years in America. Because in America, I expected to be alone. I was a stranger in a stranger's house, caring for a stranger's parent, and the loneliness made sense there. But here, in my own son's home, surrounded by my own blood, the loneliness felt like a betrayal of everything I understood about family, about sacrifice, about what all those years of work were supposed to purchase for me in the end. I began, quietly, to check my remaining balance more often. I did the math again and again, hoping I had made an error the first time. I had not. Of the substantial sum I had carried back from America, less than a third remained, spread across a savings account and a small fixed deposit I had, thankfully, not yet mentioned to Rohan. It was around this time that I noticed something that turned my stomach cold. I had left some paperwork in my room, old account statements from my years in America, documentation I kept out of habit more than necessity. And one afternoon, returning early from a walk in the garden, I found Priya in my room, going through the folder where I kept them. She startled when she saw me, quickly explaining she had been looking for a pen, though the folder was nowhere near any pen, and the drawer she had opened held nothing but my financial documents. I said nothing that day. I smiled, made some excuse about needing to organize my papers better, and let her leave the room. But that night, lying awake, staring at the ceiling fan turning slowly above me, I finally allowed myself to think the thought I had been avoiding for months. They know exactly how much I have left, and they are not finished asking. The 11th month brought the request that finally shattered whatever illusion I had left. Rohan came to me on a Sunday afternoon, and this time there was no gentle build-up, no troubled expression meant to invite my sympathy first. He simply told me, directly, that he needed a very large sum, nearly everything I had left, to put down as a deposit on a new house. Their current home, he explained, was too small now that the children were growing older, and there was a builder offering a limited-time price on a property in a better neighborhood, one with good schools nearby and a name that would mean something to his colleagues. I asked him carefully whether this new house would have my name on it as well, since I would be contributing what amounted to nearly the entirety of my life savings toward it. He looked at me the way you might look at someone who had said something faintly embarrassing in public. "Ma," he said, "of course you will live there. It will be your home too. But legally, it makes more sense for it to be in my name and Priya's name, for tax purposes, for loan purposes. You do not need to worry about these things. Have I ever let you go without a roof over your head?" Something in me, some old, tired, worn-down part of my spirit, wanted simply to agree, the way I had agreed every single time before. But another part of me, a part I had not heard from in months, finally spoke up. I told him I needed a few days to think about it. His reaction to those few words told me everything I needed to know, more clearly than any of the small cruelties of the previous months had told me. His face hardened. He stood up from the chair across from me and said, in a voice colder than I had ever heard him use with me in his entire life, "I did not expect my own mother to treat me like I am trying to cheat her." He walked out of the room before I could respond, and for the first time since I had married his father 32 years earlier, I understood, with total clarity, that I was afraid of my own child. That night, I did not sleep. I lay in the guest room that no longer felt like mine, listening to the low murmur of Rohan and Priya's voices through the thin wall separating our rooms, unable to make out words, but able to sense, from the rhythm and tone, that they were discussing me, discussing my hesitation, discussing perhaps what to do about a mother who had suddenly, inconveniently, developed doubts. The following weeks were the coldest of my life, colder even than the winters I had endured alone in New Jersey. Rohan barely spoke to me, except when necessary. Priya's politeness became a kind of performance, technically correct, but utterly hollow, the way you might treat a distant relative you were obligated to house temporarily. Even the children seemed to sense the tension, growing quieter around me, as though they had been told, without being told directly, that grandmother was somehow the source of the strange coldness in the house. I want to tell you about one particular evening, because I think it captures everything that had gone wrong more clearly than any single fact or figure could. It was Kabir's birthday, my grandson, turning 5 years old. There was a small celebration, family only, a cake, some balloons Priya had put up in the living room. I had saved secretly from what remained of my funds to buy him a proper gift, a bicycle, the kind with training wheels, something I remembered him pointing at excitedly in a shop window months earlier. When I brought it out, wrapped clumsily in paper because my hands are not as steady as they once were, Kabir's face lit up exactly the way a 5-year-old's face should light up. He ran to hug me, and for just a moment, holding my grandson, I felt something close to the joy I had imagined when Rohan first called me in America and asked me to come home. Then I looked up and saw Priya's expression, and the joy drained out of me instantly. She was not looking at Kabir's happiness. She was looking at the bicycle with a kind of calculating scrutiny, and I understood, without her saying a single word, that she was estimating its cost, wondering how much money I still had hidden away that I was spending on gifts instead of handing directly to them. That was the night I finally admitted to myself what had actually happened over the past 11 months. My son had not brought me home because he wanted to repay 16 years of sacrifice with love. He had brought me home because he knew, better than anyone, exactly how much money a woman like me could accumulate after 16 years of quiet, disciplined work in America. He had watched me, his entire adult life, working, saving, sending money home, and somewhere along the way, in a part of his heart I did not want to believe existed, he had stopped seeing his mother and started seeing an asset. I do not say this to you lightly. It is the most painful sentence I have ever had to construct about my own child. But the evidence, once I allowed myself to see it honestly, was undeniable. Every warm gesture in those first 3 months had been an investment, calculated to earn my trust before the withdrawals began. The airport greeting, the marigold garland, the guest room with the garden view, all of it had been the opening scene of a performance designed to make me feel safe enough to hand over what I had spent 16 years building. I confronted him finally, about 2 weeks after Kabir's birthday. I chose a moment when Priya and the children were out of the house, because some part of me still wanted to protect him from humiliation in front of his wife, even then, even after everything. I asked him directly, "Did you bring me back because you love me or because you wanted my savings?" He did not answer immediately, and in his silence, I heard the truth more clearly than any words could have delivered it. When he finally spoke, he did not deny it outright. Instead, he said something I will remember until the day I die. "Ma, everything I have ever done, I have done for this family. If some of that involved your money, is that not also for you? You are part of this family too. What is mine is yours, and what is yours should be ours." It was, I realized, the perfect sentence, constructed so that any objection I raised would sound selfish, would sound like I was placing my individual wealth above the collective good of the family that had once been my entire reason for living. It took every request I had ever refused, every hesitation I had ever felt, and reframed it as a betrayal on my part rather than his. I left the room without responding, walked to my guest room, and sat on the edge of the bed where I had once cried tears of joy on my very first night back in India. Now I sat there dry-eyed, strangely calm, because somewhere in that conversation, something inside me had finally completely broken, and in its place, something else, something harder and clearer, had begun to take shape. I opened my laptop that night, and for the first time in 11 months looked honestly at what remained of my finances. It was not nothing. It was, in fact, still more than many women my age in India could ever hope to possess. But it was a fraction, a small, humiliating fraction, of what I had carried back from America with such pride and such hope. I closed the laptop and made a decision that would define the rest of my life. I would not give away one more rupee, and I would not stay in a house where love had become a transaction I was expected to keep losing. Making the decision was one thing. Living it out was another matter entirely, and I want to tell you honestly that the weeks following my decision were among the hardest of my entire life. Harder even than the early years in America when I barely spoke English and cried myself to sleep in a stranger's basement. The first thing I did was quietly transfer what remained of my savings into an account Rohan did not have access to, one I opened at a different bank across town, using paperwork from my years abroad that only I possessed. I did this on a weekday morning when the house was empty, taking an auto rickshaw alone for the first time since arriving in India, feeling like a criminal for protecting my own money from my own son. That feeling, the shame of having to defend what was rightfully mine, was, I think, the cruelest part of this entire experience. Even in taking back control, I could not escape the guilt they had spent months teaching me to feel. When Rohan discovered, weeks later, that the house deposit money would not be coming, the mask he had worn during those first hopeful months disappeared entirely. There was a fight, a terrible one, the only real shouting match we had ever had in our entire relationship. He accused me of never truly loving this family, of only pretending to come home while secretly still belonging to America, to strangers, to anyone but him. Priya joined in, saying things about ungrateful mothers-in-law that I suspect she had been rehearsing for months, waiting for the right moment to release them. I sat through all of it without raising my voice, which seemed to frustrate Rohan even more than if I had shouted back. When he finally paused for breath, I asked him one simple question. In 11 months, how many times did you ask about my health, my happiness, my life, without also asking about my money? He could not answer that question. I do not think he had ever considered it before. I moved out 3 weeks later, into a small independent apartment I rented in a different part of Ahmedabad, using a modest portion of what I had managed to protect. It was not luxurious. 1 bedroom, a small kitchen, a balcony just large enough for 2 chairs, but it was mine, entirely mine, in a way that Rohan's house, despite the marigolds and the guest room with the garden view, had never truly been. The first night alone in that apartment, I will admit, I cried harder than I had cried in years, not only from grief over what I had lost financially, though that loss was real and painful. I cried because I had spent 16 years in America dreaming of a specific ending to my story, a warm home, a loving son, grandchildren climbing into my lap, not out of obligation, but out of genuine affection. And that ending had been taken from me by the very people I had sacrificed everything to provide for. But something else happened in the weeks that followed, something I did not expect. I began, slowly, to remember who I had been before I became simply Rohan's mother, or the caregiver, or the woman with the savings. I remembered that I had once been a young widow in Ahmedabad who taught herself to negotiate with tailors and vegetable sellers, who raised a son alone on almost nothing, who crossed an ocean at 42 years old with a single suitcase and built a life in a country whose language she barely spoke. That woman had never needed anyone's permission to survive. She had simply survived. I started small. I used some of my remaining savings, carefully, deliberately this time, to start a modest home-based catering business, cooking traditional Gujarati meals for working professionals in my neighborhood who missed home-cooked food. Word spread quickly. It turns out 16 years of cooking for demanding elderly Americans had taught me more about patience and precision than I realized. Within 4 months, I had more orders than I could handle alone, and I hired 2 young women from my building to help me. I also, cautiously, reconnected with some of my old friends from before I left for America, women my own age who had built their own quiet, independent lives in the decades since I had gone abroad. One of them, a widow named Meenakshi who lived 2 streets away, became a genuine friend, the kind I had not allowed myself the luxury of having in many years. We would sit on my small balcony in the evenings, drinking tea, and I found myself laughing in a way I had not laughed since before Rohan's phone call in Mrs. Whitfield's kitchen. As for Rohan, our relationship did not end entirely, though it changed into something far more careful and distant than either of us had imagined during that joyful reunion at the airport. He calls occasionally, mostly around holidays, mostly brief conversations that never quite touch the wound we both know is there. Sometimes he asks, indirectly, about my finances, and I have learned, finally, to simply change the subject without apology or guilt. I do not hate my son. I want to be clear about that, because hatred was never what I felt, even in my angriest moments. What I feel, if I am honest, is a grief similar to mourning someone who is still alive, grieving the version of him I believed existed, the version who called me home out of love rather than calculation. I do see my grandchildren, though less often than I would like, and always outside the house, in parks or small cafes, arranged quietly with Priya's reluctant permission. Ananya, older now, sometimes asks me why I do not live with them anymore, and I have not yet found the words to explain the full truth to a child. I simply tell her that grown-up families sometimes need their own separate homes to stay happy, which is not exactly a lie, even if it is not the complete truth either. I think often about the 16 years I spent in America, caring for other people's parents while my own family waited on the other side of the world. I used to believe those years were simply a sacrifice I made for my son's future, an investment whose only purpose was to fund his education and, eventually, our reunion. Now I understand something different. Those years were also, without my realizing it at the time, building the woman who would eventually have the strength to walk away from a house full of marigolds and hollow affection and build something smaller but entirely her own. I am 59 years old now. I live alone by choice, in a small apartment with a balcony just large enough for 2 chairs. My catering business grows a little more each month. I have savings again, modest but growing, and this time no one has access to them but me. I have friends who ask about my day and mean it. I have grandchildren I see less often than I wish, but who I know, deep down, still love me in whatever uncomplicated way children love the people who make them feel safe. If you are watching this and you have sent your own children abroad, or if you yourself are far from home caring for someone else's family while dreaming of returning to your own, I am not telling you this story to frighten you away from your children. Most sons and daughters would never do what mine did. But I am telling you this. Protect something for yourself. Keep something in your own name, something no one else can touch, even the people you trust the most. Not because you expect betrayal, but because love, real love, should never require you to have nothing left of your own. I came home from America believing my story was ending. I now understand it was only just beginning.